Those are perhaps among the most familiar words found in the entire Bible, especially verse 16. And I thought this morning it would be appropriate for us to reflect on new life, new beginnings. As I mentioned with the boys and girls, this time of year is a season of transition for many, a time when we say goodbye to some of the things associated with summer, perhaps. Perhaps you felt, as many did, the coolness of the air, the forecast of fall in this morning's weather. A time of transition and new seasons are upon us, a fitting time for us to think about the most profound change and transition that we can ever experience, which is being born again, new life in Jesus Christ that Jesus spoke of so clearly to Nicodemus. When you hear the words born again, what comes to mind? Or when you picture a born again Christian, what kind of image do you think of? What kind of personality features? You might think of someone who's a relatively new Christian, maybe someone who's had a dramatic conversion experience, a defining turning point in his or her life. They might have been broken. They hit rock bottom, perhaps, with nowhere to turn, and then all of a sudden, new life was sparked as they turned to God and received, by grace, the relationship that we enjoy through Jesus Christ. I still remember the day I met a man in downtown Hamilton, that's my hometown. We didn't know each other, we were complete strangers, and we just started talking and soon discovered that we were both Christians. It's interesting how you can detect that sometimes in someone else, and how wonderful it is if someone who doesn't know you can detect that in you. There's something about being a follower of Jesus Christ that is evident. That's what we should all hope happens. And it happened that day for me and for him. His name was Bob. And as we were talking together, he asked me how old I was. And I said, I'm 19. That's how old I was at the time. He said, that's great. I'm 3. I thought that was a little strange. You do meet some interesting characters on the streets of downtown Hamilton. But then I got it. He was talking about his new life. He had become a Christian 3 years prior to that conversation. And so he started counting the years of his life all over again. So when you think of a born-again Christian, you might think of someone like Bob. And if we haven't had a dramatic conversion experience like he did, we may think that being born again is something that doesn't apply to us. There's another reason we might avoid using that kind of language. When we think of a born-again Christian, we might think of someone who's rather extreme in their understanding of Christianity. You know, the born-again types who have it all figured out. The world is all black and white to them. Part of their mission is to convince everyone to believe what is so obviously clear to them. It's why they can be somewhat critical and judgmental as they spiritually size up others. No one likes being known as a critical or a harsh person who's legalistic. And so we might not want to consider ourselves as born-again Christians for that reason. We don't want to associate with those kinds of personality traits. Maybe there's another reason we don't use the words born-again Christian. We might think of a born-again Christian as someone who's a little simple, a new Christian, someone who maybe emphasizes the reliability of human emotions too much. Born-again types are always talking about how the Lord has laid something on their heart, or they feel the Lord is leading them to do something. We, on the other hand, are far more sophisticated than that, aren't we? We crave the deeper things in Christian life. We're doctrinal, we're biblical. We don't talk about our emotions that much or a personal relationship with Jesus like born-again Christians are prone to do sometimes. So we might not consider ourselves born again for all these reasons. There may be other reasons. But this morning I want to tell you why it's so incredibly important, essential for us to refer to ourselves, to know ourselves as born-again Christians. As we consider what it means to be born again, we're going to notice 4 things about it: a what, a how, a when, and a why. What it is, how it works, when it happens, and why it's so important. So what? What is it really to be born again? Well, the first thing we have to get straight in our minds is that being a born-again Christian is not a designation that only some Christians have. There are the born-again types and then all the rest of us. We have to get that straight out of our minds. Because to be a Christian, by definition, as Jesus makes clear to Nicodemus, is to be born again. And this is why this is so obviously clear in our scripture reading this morning, that being born again is something that applies to every believer. All you need to do is picture Nicodemus in your mind. Now, you might think that born-again types are emotional, broken people, needy, who've had that dramatic conversion experience in their life, intellectually inferior. Forget all about that, because picture Nicodemus. He's a Pharisee. Even more than that, he's a member of the Sanhedrin, the upper crust. He's a scholar, a pillar of the community. No one was more intelligent, more cultured, more sophisticated than Nicodemus. And what does Jesus say to him? Nicodemus, you must be born again. You see, being born again isn't just for some people, the weak or the needy or the broken or the simple. Nicodemus needed to be born again. If he needed to be born again, then everybody does. Think about this. As cultured, as intelligent, as prominent as Nicodemus was, it wasn't enough. None of it mattered when it came to having a relationship with God. Why? Because being born again is ultimately not a matter of how smart you are, how influential you are, how successful you are. It's not even a matter of how religious you are, as important as all these things are. They're all external realities that may or may not have anything to do with the reality of the human heart. I think Nicodemus is like many people today, many people who've lived over the course of Christian history. They're interested in Jesus. They're curious, intrigued. It's fascinating how no one else in human history has garnered the attention that Jesus of Nazareth has, even still today. People are incredibly attracted to him. Everyone confronts him on some level. And many of them think that Jesus was just a good man. There's a lot of good that can be said about him. But like Nicodemus, they want a relationship, if they're even going to call it a relationship with Jesus, on their own terms. They want to be quiet about it. They visit him at night, like Nicodemus, secretly, keeping him at arm's length. They're not that interested in Jesus. They don't want to get carried away like the born-again types. They don't want to get all extreme about their religious fanaticism. No, they're too sophisticated for all of that. Oh, they admire Jesus. Who couldn't admire him? All of the great things he said, especially summarized in the Sermon on the Mount, turn the other cheek and all of that. Here was a prophet, a good teacher. If only the world followed his teachings, many say, what a better place the world would be. You hear that a lot from people, don't you? Well, here's the problem with that. The problem with that assessment is that those who express admiration for the teachings of Jesus and just leave it at that have no idea about what he actually said. You cannot listen to someone talk about how he is divine, how he existed thousands of years before the time of Abraham. You can't talk about someone who talks about his death and resurrection. He's actually going to come to life again after he dies. You can't talk to someone and listen to him explain how the true meaning of life is eating his flesh and drinking his blood. You can't listen to someone talk like this and come away from it saying, wow, what a great man. What an incredible message. That's not an option. C.S. Lewis famously observed it decades ago that when it comes to confronting Jesus Christ, there are only three choices. He is either a liar who made up everything he ever said, he's a lunatic who's deranged, out of his mind, or he's Lord. He really is who he claimed to be. Those are the only three. Which is why those who say that Jesus was a good man and just leave it at that have no intellectual integrity. Because his message is not one of mere affirmation. He didn't come to make good people better. He came to make dead people alive. He said to Nicodemus, You must be born again. There's nothing affirming or pleasant about a message like that. It's not the suggestion of a celebrity guru who helps people find enlightenment, whatever that means. It's the earth-shattering diagnosis of the only one capable of fully knowing the human heart. You must be born again. And no one who really hears what Jesus said to Nicodemus ever would come away from that thinking, what a good message, what an affirming, positive teaching. No, you hear that, and if you really hear it, you realize that your entire world comes crashing down all around you. Everything that you thought was right is suddenly wrong, and you're made painfully aware of the fact that the road you're traveling on is the wrong road. That the only thing you must do is turn around, start all over again. You begin to realize, as Nicodemus might have that evening, no matter how good, righteous, intelligent, successful you may be, it's not enough. Nicodemus, you must be born again. This is the offense of the gospel. It shatters our pride, it redefines our standards, and it gets right to the heart of what we believe about God, about Jesus, about life. This is what being born again is all about. A whole new life. Not just a better person, but a new person. So how does it work? Well, perhaps the best way to think of spiritual birth is to compare it to physical birth. What can you say about the moment you were born? Hardly anything at all. Probably nothing. You were there, you experienced it, of course, but you don't remember it. One thing that must be said is that being born was not so much something we accomplished. It was something that was done to us and for us, despite all our resistance to it. This is something that especially those who have given birth know far better than any man ever can. We were completely opposed to the whole idea of being born because we liked it in our mother's womb. It was soothing, it was comfortable, all our needs were met. But suddenly everything changed. It was time to come out. The only world we knew was turned completely upside down, and we were evicted. Despite all our best efforts to resist it, we were born. The warm, soothing environment of our mother's womb was replaced with a much different environment. Bright lights suddenly shone in our eyes. Loud noises assaulted our ears. Tubes were shoved up our nostrils. The air was cold. We might have had a spank on the behind. Our lifeline, the umbilical cord, was cut off. And so we entered this strange and violent world with a cry. I've seen 4 children being born, my 4. And each time I was struck by the intensity of what was happening, how physically, emotionally, spiritually draining all of it was for the baby, for the mother, for the father. Which leads me to mention what I think is the most striking similarity between physical birth and spiritual birth, how we resist it. The only way for a child to be born is through the pain, the work, the struggle, the suffering, the blood of someone else. Sometimes we forget that. We forget how dangerous, how life-threatening it is for a woman to give birth. We live in a world of epidurals and doctors and hospitals and sterilized birthing rooms. It wasn't that long ago that this was not at all the case. And for millions upon millions of people in other parts of the world still today, giving birth is as primitive and as dangerous as it ever was. I remember when I was pastoring a church in New Jersey, I talked with someone who was looking forward to the birth of her first grandchild. So excited, so eager. And yet, there was something wrong. The child was not positioned properly in her mother's womb. She was breech. And so there was a C-section that was scheduled. Everything turned out wonderfully. Mother and child came through it beautifully. But I remember as she explained it to me, can you imagine, she said, if a situation like this for my daughter and for my grandchild, if it was a few hundred years ago, can you imagine what would have happened? And with tears in her eyes, she said they both would have died. We take so much for granted. And yet the bravest, most courageous thing a woman can ever do is give birth. Because her life is placed on the line. There was another woman in that church in New Jersey whose mother died when she was born. Well into her 80s, she spoke of that, how that was the one most profound experience that defined her life, her sacrifice, the mother's sacrifice for her, is precisely the thing that made her life. Now hold on to that thought and apply it to our spiritual birth. Because there too, the only way for a person to be spiritually born again is through the struggle, the work, the pain, the shed blood of another. It's the grace of being born again that Jesus spoke about. Our birth is the result of someone else's pain. We resist it. But there is a power that is greater than our own that makes it happen. That's why I like the footnote in John 3 that suggests that the phrase born again is better translated as born from above. That's literally what it means, born from above. It identifies the source of this power of which I'm speaking. It's above, beyond us, outside of us. It is not a power that we have that makes it happen. It is a power that is worked on us and in us and for us. When Jesus was talking to Nicodemus, he wasn't so much telling him what he, Nicodemus, had to do in order to find enlightenment or new life. No one chooses to be born. Jesus was describing what he himself had come to do, his mission for Nicodemus and for everyone. And to make that clear, he spoke about how he, like the serpent that Moses lifted up in the wilderness, would be lifted up. You remember that story, recorded in Numbers 21, how all of the people who were bitten by serpents in the desert could look at that serpent on the pole and be healed. Just so, Jesus said, all who look to the Son of Man when he is lifted up on the cross will live. It goes back even further than Numbers 21. You can think of Genesis 3, when the moment of this world's plummeting into sin occurred. How did it happen? By the work of a serpent. The ancient father of lies that beguiled Adam and Eve to eat the fruit. And because of their sin, we all are snake bit. We've got the serpent's venom coursing through our veins. It is the most chronic and pervasive spiritual disease. And there is but one cure: to look to the one who was lifted up. In our dying, we get life from him. Now this brings me to the third point about when this new life happens. When were you born spiritually? Well, Jesus hints at it here in John 3. He speaks about being lifted up on his cross, and later in the gospel, he'll speak more directly about it in John 16. Again, hear the birth imagery that's included in these verses. When Jesus spoke there about a woman giving birth to a child, he says that her pain is great because her time has come. But when her baby is born, she forgets the anguish because of her joy that a child is born into the world. Do you hear what he's saying there? Jesus is speaking about his impending death, and he's using the experience of a woman giving birth as an analogy. First the suffering, and then the joy. First death, and then life. I've seen that 4 times too. So what does Jesus know about a mother who gives birth? Why does he use that analogy? Because that's when being born again happens for you. For every child of God. You know that when a woman is pregnant, there's a due date, a day and a month circled on the calendar. Only 2% of children are actually born on their due dates, I'm told. 3 of our 4 children were, strangely enough. What is your spiritual due date? Well, It's Good Friday, the original Good Friday. That's when being born again happened. You can even speak more profoundly of it than that. You can speak about the Lamb that was slain, not on Good Friday, but before the foundation of the world. You see, at Golgotha, all time collapses. Past, present, and future all merge, coming together as one. That is our spiritual due date. We were born through the struggle, pain, and shed blood and death of another when the Son of Man was lifted up. This is what makes being born again such a gift. It's so much grace because it's been done for us. You don't need to have something to make you a more complete Christian. You don't have to acquire some knowledge or go through some kind of ecstatic spiritual experience in order to become a true believer. It's all been done for you. Christ has done it. And it's so important that we understand this, because when we do, we understand the whole point of the gospel and the whole point of our lives. The point of our lives, as Paul made clear in Colossians 3, those verses that I read earlier, is not that we acquire some new identity, but that we live out of the identity that Christ has already accomplished for us. Since then, you have been raised with Christ. Set your hearts on things above. It's not that we need to acquire anything, we just need to live out of it. Our whole purpose as Christians is to live into the gospel, the life that Christ has given us. It's why speaking about being born again is so very important. It gets to the heart of who we really are and what our lives are all about. Which brings me to my final point. We've explored the what and the how and the when. Now the why. Why is this so important? Well, many things can be said. For one thing, it helps us look at the world and at ourselves more honestly, more humbly. Many of us tend to think that all of the problems that we face are outside of us. If only my spouse was more attentive to me and my needs, we would have a much stronger marriage. If only I was smarter or a better athlete, people would like me. If I had a better business partner, my business would flourish. If I had the right kind of friends, I'd be more popular too. If this church would only go in this direction, boy, would we take off. Jesus told Nicodemus, you must be born again. It's what each of us needs, no matter how good, popular, successful, or smart you may be. Which is why we must listen carefully to what Jesus said to Nicodemus, because he's also speaking to you. You can't just be mildly interested in Jesus. You can't be a secret disciple, an anonymous believer, wanting to have a relationship with him that's strictly on your terms. Nicodemus must have thought that at first. It was a nice cool evening with a gentle breeze blowing, perfect for a nice theological debate with Jesus. But Jesus would have none of that. He cuts him off right at the very beginning of that conversation. He would have none of Nicodemus's attempts to skirt the most important question of life. And so here's the question, and I ask it with the eyes of Jesus focused on you. Are you born again? Have you been born again? Maybe no one's ever asked you that question before. I'm asking it to you now. It's not about an experience you have yet to go through. It's not about understanding the gospel more completely. It's simply about accepting the gift, the life of the one who spoke to Nicodemus and who speaks to us now. Many have wondered about Nicodemus. Did he ever become a believer? Or was he always just this curious, secret disciple? Well, we have good reason to believe that Nicodemus was born again, that he actually experienced the very things that Jesus spoke to him about. How do we know that? Well, he resurfaces in John's Gospel in chapter 19. At Golgotha, when he took the dead body of Jesus down from the cross with Joseph, that dead, unclean, offensive corpse that no Pharisee, much less ruler of the Sanhedrin, would ever have come close to, much less touched. He took that body and wrapped it in clean linen. He and Joseph brought 75 pounds of myrrh and aloes to embalm Jesus. 75 pounds. Extravagant. A burial fit for a king, which perhaps Jesus had become for him by then. It's interesting in John 19, that other reference to Nicodemus does not call him, as we read in John 3, a man of the Pharisees. In chapter 19, he is the man who had earlier visited Jesus at night. Earlier. Perhaps his now former way of life. The life where he was just curious about Jesus, but not committed to him. No longer a Pharisee, he visits Jesus again, a new man with the life of Christ surging in him. If you know him as your king, then you know there is new life in you as well. You've been born by his pain, his struggle, his death, and now we grow out of that and ever into it until we see his face. And to that, let all God's people say. Please pray with me. Lord, thank you for these your words that show us clearly what it means to know you, to receive life from you. Thank you, Lord Jesus, for coming to us not in condemnation but grace. Thank you for your work that has given us life now and life that will never end. And I pray that all of us here today will claim and receive the gift that you freely offer. I pray that you will enter our hearts, perhaps the hearts of those who have kept you at a distance, who've wanted to just have a relationship with you on their own terms. Shatter all of that, Lord, as you penetrate every heart and draw us ever deeper into the life we have in you, we pray in your strong name. Amen.